Well, they're back in the headlines, I think, mainly in 2022 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then we had no idea how badly that would escalate. But then most recently, we've had the U.S. twice bombing of Iran, supposedly when there were negotiations, and then all for this reason, or one of the reasons was that potentially they were developing a nuclear weapon, although there was not any ostensible evidence of that. And then there are constantly daily headlines, like Macron's statement that France is going to play a stronger role in providing nuclear deterrence for Europe. So yeah, we're seeing nuclear weapons in the headlines, I would say, several times a month right now. Yes, definitely. And we can see that even just over the most recent last decade, because the US and Russia and China are all undergoing a nuclear revolution, which means that they're revamping, upgrading their weapon system and upgrading their nuclear command and control system. So that's indubitable. It is hard to imagine the end of NATO just because it's been with us for decades. And I guess it would, if the US just pulled out of NATO, then it would at least, I don't know, could it keep going as an alliance without the United States? Definitely it would have to rethink how it's handling nuclear weapons, because right now NATO has the nuclear sharing with the United States, and the way that that would work when the US were no longer there, it would be completely uncharted territory. And I think that's why we've seen the announcement by Macron of France to try to find a way for France to maybe step into that role of supplying some of the nuclear deterrence for Europe if the United States is falling behind as an ally in supplying that. There is absolutely no doubt about that as well. As I had mentioned at the beginning, I'm also working at the University of Helsinki as a political scientist, and I have been in Finland during that time where Finland had been known for the Helsinki Accords and for being a meeting place, even recently in 2018 with Trump and with Putin, and had been very firmly behind diplomacy as a means to resolve conflict. And then with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, now President Alexander Stubb actually ran on his presidential campaign saying that Finland should be open to nuclear sharing. So we've definitely seen a huge shift in sentiment about nuclear weapons. In my analysis, the UK is in the driver's seat in the sense that I guess it happened so stealthily and so at that level below the headlines that the UK has just gotten the B6112 nuclear gravity bombs. UK just decided to get those weapons from the United States, and it's still ambiguous whether that's NATO nuclear sharing or whether it's some kind of defense cooperation agreement. And actually, that violates the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, countries that didn't have nuclear weapons, and in this case the UK had those gravity bombs but had gotten rid of them in the 1990s. And so to reintroduce them is arguably, and I've read legal opinions, that it is definitely a violation of the NPT for the UK to do that. And in that way, when you think about Finland, Poland, maybe South Korea, all the countries now that are talking about getting nuclear weapons as a type of deterrent, and that would be a type of proliferation, you see that UK has already done that and nobody even realized. So that the UK leadership on that is basically saying, yes, everyone should have nuclear sharing and everybody needs nuclear weapons, without even really looking at what is the import of those weapons, what scenarios would they be used under, and how does that work in NATO with the current, what do you call it, reticence of the United States to be the kind of ally that we would all hope them to be. Nuclear weapons are still an existential risk in 2026. And I think more importantly, to understand what existential risk is, that is the kind of risk that would wipe out at least 90% of humanity. And it was nuclear weapons that, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki and then the development of the thermonuclear bomb, it was nuclear weapons that made that possibility of eliminating humankind within hours, weeks, and months a reality. So yes, we've never dealt with having these nuclear weapons. I think the Oppenheimer movie that probably many people saw, when you see that movie go from just the initial atomic bomb to then talking about the development of the thermonuclear bomb, which was after the time length of the film, but that showed that we hadn't dealt with that question of how to make sure that we actually have security instead of proliferating existential risk through developing increasing numbers of these weapons and proliferating them to additional countries. That is a very deep and important question. So obviously, if you talk to security experts who wouldn't want to give up nuclear weapons, they will tell you that absolutely yes, having nuclear weapons makes their world anyway safer. That would be whichever countries have the nuclear weapons will feel safer if they have nuclear weapons under their command and control. However, then if you look at all of the countries that don't have nuclear weapons, you can say, is the world safer from the perspective of all those remaining of 192 countries minus the 9 that have the nuclear weapons? Are they safer? Absolutely not. Because if there's a nuclear war, and we know now that even a small nuclear war between India and Pakistan could then trigger a nuclear winter. A nuclear winter means that there's sufficient tons of carbon soot that go into the atmosphere that it will make a cloud over in the higher atmosphere of the planet, and that would block out the sunlight and lead to famine. So from the perspective of all those remaining countries, I think unequivocally the nuclear weapons don't make the world a safer place. So then we have to start asking, well, maybe those security experts that put so much hope in the nuclear weapons, maybe we should all be thinking about what is the existential risk posed by those weapons, and what is a more secure path towards security that would have the really big vision that we want to live. Like Cambridge University has been here for 800 years. What if we want to make sure the planet and human civilization is going to continue under the, with the 800 years of the past? Then we would probably try to look at ways to minimize that we would end up in some kind of a nuclear war. So there's the different perspectives on that question. So we've all been told that the New START agreement has expired, and that then there should be, we could potentially be pessimistic that we don't have arms control agreements. However, let's just step back and remember that we have the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we have the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And even though Donald Trump, President of the United States, has said that he is contemplating reinstigating nuclear tests, nobody really knows what he means by that and whether he means full-out atmospheric tests. But I think for the time being, we should remember that there is still not just a semblance of, but an actual existing system of international rules and norms that are holding into the space. And so as long as we have that NPT treaty and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, then we shouldn't just look at the treaties that we're struggling to maintain, but we should also look at our successes and still having the backbone of those other treaties and agreements. So the risk question, here we're looking at risk that is uncertain in the sense that we're talking about extreme events. We're not talking about events like you go to a casino and you know if you're playing poker or if you're playing a familiar game, you know the odds because that's how a casino works. But we're talking about extreme events such as a nuclear war, and we're talking about trying to understand the risks and the uncertainties posed by what kind of triggering events could happen. So when you bring AI into that equation, and you bring AI in terms of its very rapid development, and we in the public don't have a clear idea of how AI systems are being used in military context, because of course that's top secret. But we do know, we have some information. We have information that if you bring AI into the loop in decision making, we know that many of the systems seem to defer to escalating preemptively and quickly, and so that could bring in the risk of escalating into nuclear war. And then we also know that in command and control systems, which would need to have some ability to detect if there's an incoming strike or attack, then if you bring AI into the loop, it could play different roles. It could play the role of pattern recognition, trying to figure out, is this a hostile attack? And it could also be invoked to actually help with the decision making about what should the next step be. I'm not sure if people know generally that the decision making window to launch, say, even a full out nuclear strike on an adversary is 15 minutes. And so when you think about how would you make a decision about whether to launch a counterattack if you had this information that there was an attack, then you could imagine that leaders would just default to asking AI systems. But there is a risk that the AI systems that, I guess that expression, they don't have skin in the game, or they aren't living creatures the way human beings are, and they don't pay the same price for having that destruction. So there's another risk from the fact that we're outsourcing decisions to systems that aren't sentient beings and don't have the history and experience that humans do. Not that humans are infallible, but that this would bring in an additional risk. Yes. And the reason for that is that the old systems were analog, and what that meant was that you would even need like an actual switch, a mechanical device, a switching mechanism to turn them on and off. But if we imagine that these new command and control systems, that it might be hard to keep them from online contact, because all of these systems are supposed to be air-gapped and secure in every conceivable way from any kind of a signal or a electromagnetic ability to intercede with those systems so that they could be impacted, for example, to launch a nuclear weapon. So if you're moving to digital systems, it's much harder to be absolutely 100% secure that someone couldn't bring in a digital code and in some way be able to intervene in that system. And let's imagine that China and the United States, and say Russia too, let's say their command and control systems are 100% impervious to any kind of a cyber attack. Let's just imagine. But can we be sure then that we can say the same of India and Pakistan or North Korea? So we're all in the same nuclear security dilemma, and a nuclear war fought or a nuclear attack from any country is going to affect us all potentially. So in that way, again, yes, we're vulnerable from cyber attacks, and it'll be hard to know exactly how much because it's not public information getting underneath the hood and looking at those command and control systems. The conventional wisdom used to be that we should shore up everybody's command and control system because we didn't want to be on the receiving end of something going wrong with somebody else's command and control system. But now I think people feel like everything's a free-for-all, and if you can grab control of an enemy's nuclear weapons, then so much the better. So there's been kind of a changing in thought about the sacrosanctness of nuclear command and control systems. So the public should understand, first and foremost, that there's no defense against a nuclear attack. So that having nuclear weapons, you can say they're a deterrent which would prevent an attack, but once you are attacked, if a gravity bomb is dropped on you, it's going to explode. Then all you can really do is counterattack. So they don't bring security in that fundamental way. And then the second thing that publics should know about nuclear weapons is that they could be put into strategies in different ways. They could be there to deter against a nuclear attack or an existential threat to the state. However, there's another school of strategic logic in the United States, the nuclear warfighting school, which argues that we should treat nuclear weapons as no different from conventional weapons, and that they should plan to fight and win a nuclear war. And what this means is that you could imagine a war where people are volleying at each other these tactical nuclear weapons without any clear or guaranteed firewall that the escalation would stop. So that inherently carries a lot of existential risk for a pretty serious nuclear incident that could be that devastating nuclear winter that would lead to the collapse of civilization as we know it today. First use is a really important concept and deployment strategy for nuclear weapons. So first use means that a nation that has a first use stance says it would attack another country using a nuclear strike first before they had been attacked. And that then defies the idea that nuclear weapons are there primarily as a deterrent against nuclear attack, because then a country is saying, no, I reserve the right to use these nuclear weapons. The United States, for example, says against cyber attack, against a chemical attack, against biological attacks. So then no one's ever really sure whether a nuclear attack would be forthcoming. And I think in the situation where President Trump said that he would bomb Iran back to the Stone Ages, no one was sure if that meant that the U.S. would use a first-use strike against Iran before they had used a nuclear weapon, which they don't even have. So, and a no first-use pledge it leads to more security, because it means that you don't have to worry that you're going to get struck by a nuclear weapon. And China and India both have no first-use policies, which means that they are not going to be the first to initiate a nuclear war. And in the disarmament community, it's generally thought that if all countries could move to a no first-use policy, then that would be fundamentally de-escalating in terms of the risk of going into a nuclear war situation. So no first use is an absolutely fundamental concept. And the U.S. has been the one that's always had a first use policy. They had a first use policy on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Russia didn't give up. They had a no first use policy until 1993. And China still upholds a no first use policy. There's also alert status, and alert status means that the weapons are ready to go instantly versus having to be fielded and then deployed and then launched. And China still does not have their weapons on alert status, so there's no imminent danger of a nuclear strike from China. Well, I think the important thing to know there is that it was the anti-nuclear movement in the 1980s that was fundamental to making sure that when Reagan and Gorbachev moved towards arms control, that it was this public knowledge that they were not secure with all these nuclear weapons, and it was the public amplifying their status by protesting. And yes, it really made a difference in the 1980s. So today, there would have to either be that or some kind of an equivalent, which who knows, with social media, there could be lots of ways to have some kind of viral movement that brought up an awareness about how dangerous nuclear weapons is. So yes, but it could take a new form today. Well, we do believe that in civil society with vital democracies, constitutional democracies, it's a fundamental tenet that citizens know enough to vote for officials, and that officials too are educated enough to make solid, sound policies. So from that point of view, having the public knowledge about the potential impact of nuclear weapons, and it goes also into financial implications, it goes into all of this, the implications of this vast establishment that's necessary to maintain these arsenals. It's absolutely fundamental that publics are aware of like the contours of this nuclear arms establishment, which is the primary way of projecting political power across the world. Yes, definitely. Publics need to know. Yes, so I guess it was going on about a year and a half ago, I decided to create an open source textbook and to develop this with a group of master's students at the University of Helsinki that would systematically break down this vast weapons establishment. We broke it down into, I guess it was 32 chapters, and those 32 chapters cover everything from nuclear winter to how the money works to pay for all of these weapons, to the technology of the weapons, to deterrence theories, to treaties. And I think this is a very good introductory textbook that anybody could read any section of it. You don't have to read the whole thing, but to create a resource that would be for free for anyone was a project I took on and completed. And then after completing the textbook, we actually have it as an open source, open university course at the University of Helsinki. And it's the only open source online course that you can get university credits for in the whole world that deals with this question of, it's called Nuclear Weapons, Planetary Risks, and Human Consequences. So the textbook is in the Apollo archive here at the University of Cambridge. So if you look for that title, which is Nuclear Weapons, Planetary Risks, and Human Consequences, you will be able to just download the textbook for free. It's interesting because I think being the director for the Center of the Study of Existential Risk has made me much more optimistic in the sense that so many of us would put our lives in the line to actually do good in the world. So many of us would do that, but we just don't know how, and hopefully it wouldn't become that dramatic. But I think mostly it's the cynicism and the sense of inevitability that we need to fight within ourselves and as a society, because we can write totally different futures, I'm convinced.